And there's been an improved risk assessment process developed in recent years to try to really focus how threats are identified and how treatments are prescribed. With treatments like hydromulch and helicopter mulching, the cost of doing treatments has gone up a whole lot since we used to just get out there and dump thousands of pounds of ryegrass seed on burned areas. So the focus now is on, what is the risk, how likely is it to happen, and then what treatment should we be using. And then invasive plant treatments are limited to 1 year post-fire. It used to be, I think you could go out and treat for invasives for more than 1 year, but now it's just 1 year. This is a new risk assessment matrix that Bayer teams use. And so what you do is you look at first of all, the magnitude of the consequence of the threat. So is it going to be a major consequence, moderate, or minor? And then how likely is it to occur? So is it very likely that the event that you're worried about, like a rainstorm in a critical slope, will occur? Sort of likely, possible, or unlikely? And then this matrix, basically these ones in red here are the most likely to get funded for treatment. So if you have what could be a fairly moderate threat and it's not that likely to happen, probably doesn't warrant spending a lot of money trying to ameliorate it. Okay, and then finally, the third type of rehab, third type of post-fire rehab is rehabilitation and restoration. And this is actions taken to repair or improve lands unlikely to recover naturally from wildfire damage. So this would be reforestation and recovering your damaged chaparral. Minor facilities damaged by fire can be replaced this way. Longer-term actions, 1 to 3 and even more years, would fall under this category. And the important thing is that there's no emergency funding available to do this. The burned area emergency response, there is a pool of emergency money that's available to do those treatments, but anything falling into this rehabilitation and restoration category has to come out of regular Forest Service program funds, which becomes scarcer every year. And so it's harder to do some of these treatments unless extra allocations are provided. Types of treatments that fall in this category would be restoring heritage sites, maintaining trails other than those that cause an immediate emergency, replacing burned facilities, and I highlighted ones relevant to chaparral restoration, wildlife or fish habitat restoration. You can do some emergency treatments in threatened and endangered species habitat under Bayer if federally listed species is going to be severely affected by the after effects of fire. But for just regular habitat restoration, that has to come under this other category. Reforestation is under there as well. Replacing fences in general, unless it's a fence that's needed to keep somebody out of an area that's going to cause more damage, would also fall under regular restoration. Restoration funding has generally been decreasing to the Forest Service in recent years. Back before 2004, the level was way up here somewhere for restoration funds. Now it's down less than $20 million a year. The big jumps here are after fires in 2007 and 2008. I find it kind of interesting that Southern California fires were all in 2007. That was the second wave of big fires after the wave of big fires in 2003. So there was some money for restoration after that. And then this big jump here is in response to the big 2008 fire bust, does everybody remember the big lightning outbreak in Northern California? There were fires everywhere. That's timber. We got to replant timber. That gets more money than chaparral. So anyway, to recap here, 3 types of post-fire rehabilitation. There's suppression rehabilitation, which is done with the incident funds as part of incident cleanup before the crews leave. Emergency stabilization, which comes out of its own funding source, and is activities that have to be carried out generally within the first 12 months after the fire to alleviate an emergency caused immediately after the fire. And then rehabilitation and restoration to repair long-term damages comes out of regular funding and can be anywhere from one to 3 to even more years after fire. For more information, there are a number of BEAR websites that you can look at and find other presentations that have been saved. This one's for Forest Service folks, internal. These two are available outside. The Rocky Mountain Research Station Lab in Moscow, Idaho has a lot of studies that we've worked on jointly with them posted. And then the BEAR catalog is a catalog of treatments, how to install them, and things like that. All right. I'm going to hand the presentation over to Marty Witter. This one, and open hers. Let's see. There we go. Find it in the intro here. Okay. Go ahead, give it to you. Marty's the Marty Witter is a fire ecologist with the Mediterranean Coast Network of the National Park Service. Job she's had since 2001, and she has also been working with the California Fire Science Consortium as their implementation coordinator, getting information out there to folks on fire science and how you can best use it, and there's a whole bunch more on here too, but I'll just let Marty talk.
Thanks, Dan. Okay, works. Actually, Jan gave a fabulous introduction so that you now understand the basic process of the BEAR and the BAR program. So I'm going to talk a little bit more just about the NPS process that we have used in the Santa Monica Mountains from our recent experiences in the last decade or so. So there are 3 parks in the National Park Service in Southern California. There's Channel Islands, Santa Monica Mountains, and Cabrillo National Monument. And one of these parks is subject to burning. So in the last 2 decades, we've had 7 major fires, and of those, we prepared BEAR plans for 3: the 2005 Topanga fire, the 2007 Corral fire, and last month's May 2003 Springs fire. So I would say that our park is a nice microcosm of the problems that you have after major fires in Southern California. We have fragmentation, we have high fire frequency, we have wildland urban interface, we've got it all. So do we need to do BAR or BEAR in Southern California? Is there an emergency after our fires? And I think the uniform question to that is always yes. So Jan already talked about some of the problems, and I'm sure that everyone here has experienced some aspect of them. So what I want to concentrate on is you've gotten the overview of the BEAR and the differences between BEAR and BAR. And I'm going to try and focus on those, and I'll give you examples of things that we've done in the park, because it turns out that whether something is BEAR or whether something is BAR can sometimes be a fine line, and it depends on working with your regional BEAR coordinator and developing policies and being prepared ahead of time to get projects underway after a fire. So most importantly, excuse me. So most importantly, the National Park Service does have the option of having a budget for bird area rehabilitation. So we do have the ability to repair fire-caused damages. Funding sources are limited though. And we at the National Park Service are the little agency of the Department of the Interior. So our budget for this fiscal year is just over $2 million. So that's nationwide. So there is a lot of scrutiny on activities that are proposed. BAR funding, although it's available, is even more limited. So although there's a $20 million budget, that budget again is nationwide, but it's also Department of Interior wide, so it's competitive. And projects need to compete among all the agencies. BAR funding is already exhausted at this time in the fiscal year. So although we've just had a fire, there's no BAR funding available to do any treatments. As with all of the federal budgets, they're expecting declines in this funding pool for fiscal year 14 and fiscal year 15. So when you think about the projects that you want to do, it's important to look at the funding timeline. So we normally have fall fires, which means that we're preparing a plan at the beginning of the fiscal year. So in the past, we've done very well because there's been a fair amount of money both for BEAR and for BAR projects because we're situated well. Our recent May fire, though, is not so good. So there is no BAR funding at this time, and any BAR projects we want to start, we need to apply for, and they can't begin until October. One of the most important points that I think I can make is you need to be prepared if you want to use BEAR and if you want to use BAR. And by preparation, there's a whole range of things that need to be done. The first is that in the National Park Service, we're a small agency. So unlike the Forest Service that I believe has standing BEAR teams for every forest that can be deployed on a fire, we really build our teams from the park up. So those people need to be prepared and ready to take on the jobs of going out, assessing damages in a wildfire, and taking the time and effort to put together a plan. So the park needs to be committed to supporting people to do that. And we really lack, and it became clear in our last fire, that a lot of our resources people who are able to go out and do evaluations do not have the fire training and the red card qualifications to go out during that critical period of time and do the assessment. So it becomes a bit of a bottleneck in getting the project done. And then finally, if people are going to start thinking about the aftermath of fires and using funding mechanisms like BEAR and BAR, then it's really crucial to have those kinds of projects that you want to do formalized in your land management plans, in your projects that you're doing. So you need to be able to show that there has been an investment and a recognition of critical resources before the fire hits. Because once the fire hits, it's way too late to get any of that stuff together. The other thing is that you have to be prepared to work fast. It's an emergency. Our recent fire, Springs Fire, started on the 2nd of May, ran to the ocean the first day, second day, ran back to the north. In 36 hours, it had covered more than 20,000 acres. And in the next, 12 hours, it reduces final size to 24,000 acres. So, Jan has emphasized that you have a short timeline to get these things together. Oops, excuse me. So, here's the fire, there it is, it's spreading. And then during this time, people are doing containment, they're working on the line, they're getting things under control. But it's really a chaotic time. At the same time, there's ongoing fire operations, there's emergency operations at the park, deal with the new open burn area, there's suppression rehab that's going on, and you need to get your bear field assessments in. So there's a lot of people doing a lot of different things out in the park. And again, if your resource advisors, who are local people, don't have the qualifications, that becomes a bottleneck in getting these field assessments done. So finally, there's 10 days, there's 10 days to get these plans together. Now, we build our teams from the ground up. So, our fire management officer, Kathy Kirkpatrick, is the liaison between the active fire incident and the people who are starting to try and do the bear assessments and put the plan together. But most of these people are park staffs. And what we found is that we have occasionally called in supplementary cultural resource specialists, and we don't have anyone qualified to do hydrological or geological analysis. So we often request someone with those qualifications. So we do a watershed analysis, but we're the Park Service, and we don't tend to do any of the large landscape level erosion control treatments. We don't do mulching, we don't do seeding. We do work with the cities and counties and agencies adjacent to the park to be prepared for flooding and debris events. And the most important things that we tend to do are to close off the park and provide warnings and public notifications. And within our park, we do, of course, emergency stabilizations to protect our roads and infrastructures with protective devices as needed. But it's more point protection rather than landscape level treatments. And then we do, it burns, it runs off, there's more sediment. Fire timing has a strong effect on what you can do. So, oops. There we go. So, depending on when your fire occurs, it's going to depend on what is your priority treatment. What do you have to do right away? Most of our fires in the past have been in the fall. So this is a graph of monthly rainfall. So normally October, November, after these fires, we can have major rainstorms any time after the fire. And I believe after this 2007 fire, we had a 2-inch rainstorm that caused a lot of flooding and rockfall. But here we are in May with a fire. So we're going to have a burned landscape for a very long time. But we have lots of time to deal with the cities and counties to decide how we're going to handle any emergency flow conditions. So what can't we do? All of the fun things you want to do after fire, we really can't do. We can't monitor fire effects. We can't do systematic inventories for cultural resources or invasive species. You can't do invasive species treatments to achieve better than pre-fire conditions. You can't do sort of new road maintenance and reconstructions, and you can't repair or replace major facilities. And that's not what Optimal does. So, I think I'll go through this pretty quickly because Jan really covered it. So, emergency closures are probably one of the most important things that we can do. And importantly, our recent fire burned both state parks and national parks that sort of form a unified trail system. So we are doing a coordinated system of signage throughout the entire burn area. You can do, when buildings burn down, you can do hazardous waste removal, emergency debris removal, culvert cleaning. This is an interesting case. So I want to talk a little bit about these differences between BEAR actions and BAR actions, which are rehabilitation. So clearing this trail is an emergency action. So that's funded under emergency stabilization funds. Recycling the rock to build the staircase is considered a BAR project. So it was an emergency, and it was restoring to a trail that was damaged by fire activity. And public information, hugely important for us. And again, law enforcement is also hugely important for us because once these parks burn down, we are in the wildland urban interface, and we have tremendous pressure on the park for users to come in and go off trail. So we put in fences if we need to, gates. We increase LED patrols and put up new signage. And something we've been able to do in the past, so one of the things we've been able to do in the past is assess known cultural sites, both with fire damage and assess their vulnerable to post-fire impacts. This is something that's now, as budgets become tighter, we are definitely seeing certain things that we've been able to do in the past receive a lot more scrutiny. So this is one of the things that is unclear whether we will still be able to continue to do this as an emergency stabilization activity. And for this recent Springs fire, we have 109 sites, amazingly significant shelter needs in the Hoya Valley. And one of our fire personnel who just patrolled the area found this carpool. So it's definitely a major concern and very significant part. And if you can't assess the sites, then emergency stabilization will pay for actions necessary to protect those sites. So now I'm just going to give some examples of when BEAR and when BAR. So normally if you have a staircase and it burns up in a fire, that's a minor facility, and you would repair it under BAR, repairing post-fire repair. So this is a staircase, went in, built by the Boy Scouts just before the fire. These are the stairs after the fire. And normally, we would have to leave those. But these stairs form a critical route of probably one of the most popular hikes in the park. If these stairs were used illegally, they would have undermined the existing foundations. So this is a project that, well, normally BAR was approved for emergency rehabilitation. This is another example. So, bear bar. We have, herpetological, monitoring, with pitfall traps. And this is a, bucket in the center of these, arrays. I think 32 of these were just installed in the last year, within the burn parameter. And what happened is they're not in active use and being monitored. They have tops on them to keep animals from falling in. So all the tops burned off. So as part of the assessment, our wildlife biologist went out and looked at what had happened. And she put in rescue sticks so that anyone who had fallen in could find out. But what's being proposed is we're proposing under bear, under emergencies, to take out the bucket, put it on the top, so that nothing can fall in. But then to come back with a future proposal for bar to reconstruct the entire pitfall array. And we have had pitfall arrays funded in the past for bar. Now, restoration. This is where it really matters what is in your general management plan or your resource management plan, or what activities the park has set as a priority. So we have done a couple of projects. First was in Topanga Canyon in 2005, where we've been doing restoration work for 3 years and had experimental results on the Silver Grassland establishment, and the fire came and burned through it. So that was it was Oak Savanna habitat. It was identified as high resource value in that park. And so we were able to fund a 3-year program of grassland planting and seeding for 3 years. That was under bar. Again, both of those fires, if you remember the timeline, did occur at the beginning of the fiscal year. So I don't know if that was part of what contributed to it. There's also a much higher budget at the time that those were done. Same thing in 2005 Corral Fire. This is a field break with Euphorbia terracina. This is Solstice Canyon, a canyon with a perennial stream with potential steelhead trout. A lot of restoration work and dollars has been spent in this area already. So again, with the park being able to demonstrate a financial commitment to this area and a high priority, then we were able to secure funding for that. But the question now is, I'm surprised by Jan saying that invasive species control is allowed for the first year under there, because the DOI is trying to put all of the invasive species control under bar. So with this recent fire we had, it's one of the most significant native perennial grasslands in Southern California. Major perennial weeds, garden grass, fennel. And so we have proposed a eradication project that we want to fund it under bar with no money. So we are proposing to do a reduced emergency treatment for 3 months, and then see if we can come back and get money. So I think that's all for examples. I'll close out with this.
Thank you, and we have one more talk on post-fire assessment, and then we'll have another discussion session like we did before the break. So our next speaker, and let me get the talk up here. There we go. is Dr. Ramon Vallejo from the University of Barcelona in Spain. And as Hugh introduced him earlier, he's been doing a lot of work on post-fire restoration. All right, I gotta find the slideshow button here. There we go. It's gotta get back to the beginning. There we go. All right, we got the right slide up here. At any rate, he's a professor in the plant biology department at the University of Barcelona, Spain, and also the director of the Forest Research Program at the Mediterranean Center for Environmental Studies, CEAM. And so I will let Ramon take it away.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, Hugh, and all the organizers of the first service to invite me to present our experience in post-fire restoration in Spain and in the other countries in the European Mediterranean. Through several, we were working with other countries through several multinational projects, like this one, which is already running, and where John TV over there is involved as well. So I hope my presentation is not too exotic for you, at least less harmful than our native species, not that invasive, not native there, invasive here. I hope we will find something in common, perhaps something not that in common, as you will see. So in our Mediterranean basin, we have our land has been very deeply transformed because of long-term overexploitation, more than millennia of overexploitation, through deforestation, land degradation, and desertification in general. So, in addition to this long-term degradation, we had very huge afforestation in the Mediterranean side of my county and the other countries as well, especially since the end of the 19th century. The reason for these afforestation were that the landscape was so degraded that we had terrible floodings near the coast, and then we started to recover the fed water through these large, huge reforestation programs, mostly using pines. So the traditional approach for afforesting the land, and we'll say restoring the land in the techniques that were used at those times, was always introducing in the degraded lands pines, conifer, but usually pines, and then these species that were supposed to support better these stressful conditions in the degraded lands, and they were expected that by 1 century or so to recover the soil properties, and then to facilitate the recovery of other species, more representative of more mature stages of our vegetation. So this was the traditional approach for more than 1 century, and then in part because of this tradition, we have our county plenty of pine forest. This was the main approach for 1 century. So what perhaps special characteristic in our landscapes in relation to fires and in relation to the recovery of the ecosystem after fire is the land use history. As I said, our land has been overexploited for centuries, but since the 70s in the last century, we have started a very, very deep process of land abandonment. So many of the land that were cultivated in the past, making terraces, for example, in the slopes, have been slowly abandoned, and they were colonized by more or less natural vegetation that may increase the fuel load and increase the risk of fires. In fact, the problem of large fires started in the last quarter of the last century. So this is perhaps the distinctive key driver in our situation. Then when we have a fire, we see it is It's very common to see, in some cases, shrublands, more or less similar to chaparral, that were never plowed. Plowing is really one of the critical factors of degradation. We could find pine woodlands in all fields, and we can find shrublands in all fields as well. So, just to compare with chaparral, where are the shrublands in our systems? Well, we have the Mediterranean range of conditions that are precipitation between 1,350 millimeters. In dry areas, we have the semi-arid, where we don't have the problem of fires because of lack of fuel. And then the precipitation by potential to transpiration ratio is around 4.75 to 0.5. Semi-arid or lower. Another distinctive characteristic perhaps in the Mediterranean is that the abundance of calcareous substrates is much higher than in the rest of Mediterranean climate regions in the world. So we have forests, of course, deciduous oaks, evergreen oaks, mixed with pine or pine forest, and these sclerophyllous shrubs that will be equivalent to the chaparral appear in the understory of this forest. So they are not exclusive for the shrublands, but they appear as well in this forest, especially the obligate flowers. And then we have, as I mentioned before, this extensive pine plantation, artificial pine plantations. These systems, dominated by oaks and obliques, with the understory with obligate sprouters, is extremely resilient to fire. So these systems never, this kind of ecosystem, this kind of vegetation never disappeared for any recorded fire regime. Pine forests, they are really very sensitive to short fire recurring intervals because they require at least 15 to 20 years to produce cones and to have enough seeds to germinate after fire. In many cases, in extremely degraded lands, which are very abundant, by the way, there was sometimes in the history, there was a selective oak and other species uprooting. This was for many reasons, but one of the reasons was producing charcoal in the crisis times. In these cases, we moved from forests to shrublands, if the obligate sprouters remain there, and we have this kind of shrublands called matorral, maquis, garrick, different times, but they are dominated by these obligate sprouters, which are these sclerophyllous shrubs. And we could have some scattered oaks and pines. We only have permanent shrublands in extreme situations. For example, in extremely shallow soils, in the highlands, on the semi-arid. And then these shrublands, they have been affected by cropping and abandonment, which affect large lands, large proportion of our lands. These become other kind of shrublands dominated by obligate cedars or facultative cedars in some cases, with few sclerophyllous species, especially in these old fields. These other kind of shrublands are much more fire-prone, and they could become even more degraded to dwarf shrublands or even like grasslands. A little bit the picture of the position of shrublands in our landscapes. So that's why when we go on restoration, we mix shrublands with forest because there are transitions in the several stages. Well, what is important, I will insist a lot in the obligate sprouter because they are key in the post-fire recovery on the assessment of post-fire rehabilitation. The abundance of sprouters is very high in never crop areas, in never cultivated areas. They can suffer fires, but they remain and they will sprout. When they are affected by cultivation and abandonment, these old fields are colonized by these obligate cedars, which are very good colonizers, and then they tend to produce very quick fuel accumulation and short-term fire cycles. Secondly, is only effective when the distance from the seed sources is very short. So it depends a lot on the structure of the landscape. If there are very large spots of this kind of systems, the recovery of the natural strophios never happen. It would happen perhaps in centuries. And then we have this MAI where the vegetation is very scarce, so there's no problem for fire. John mentioned about the reference, which is our reference for restoration. And we don't have pristine forest, of course, or even chaparral, or even other kind of vegetation. What we call our best reference is there are never cultivated areas. That could be forests or tall shrublands. And it is the case of what we call in the old Spanish chaparral. It means a small forest with multi-stem oaks. This is the meaning of chaparral in the Spanish in Spain. So this is one of our references for restoration. We don't know what was before the human activity for this long time ago. So what is our problem for the conservation of our systems? It's the combination of recurrent fires with the old cultivation. This is the best, the worst combination of factors. We could have this very cultivated mixed forest or oak forest. When we have cultivation, we could have forests, pine forest, woodlands, in oak fields. With recurrent fires, it becomes degraded shrublands with this oligate cedar dominating, accumulating a lot of fuel, very fire prone. And if we have repeat fires here, we can have a kind of patchy scrubland which is becoming similar to the semi-arid area, but in wetter conditions. So the question we are trying to find out right now is what is the taking point for this degradation and in how reversible are these situations. Well, said before, the critical point in post-fire recovery is the abundance, in our system now this is the abundance of obligate cedars. I put this an example in northwest Spain where there are several Erica species, there are several other species. Only one of them, of the dominant species, is Erica opelata, is obligate cedar. The others are sprouted, the other forms are sprouted, and these are the fires in spring and autumn. 2 years after the fire, the obligate cedar, the plant cover of the obligate cedar is almost nothing. It goes 40% at the beginning before the fire, and it becomes almost nothing in 2 years. All the other sprouters have in 2 years recovered the same plant cover as before the fire, both in this spring fire and the autumn fire. So this is the question. This is the question for the recovery and the degradation risk of the systems. Using the same data, this is the spring fire, autumn fire, this was high severity, this is low severity, it doesn't matter in this case. So the plant cover before the fire in Erica opelata was 40%, and most of this area was uncovered, was bare soil 2 years later. That means the soil was exposed to erosion. So that make the immediate risk of degradation of the system of fire. So the sprouters, the abundance of sprouters is important for the early recovery of the system, but not all the sprouters, as was mentioned before, are equally efficient. I put an example, just concentrate here, because for obligate sprouters, some of them, they are very high, the vigorous sprouter, they are medium, and they are very low. So in our case, in our system in the Mediterranean, most of them, the majority of them, the Sclerophyllus species, characteristic of this our matorral, they are vigorous post-fire obligate sprouters. So this is the marasmo model. I recognize it. So all these genera, we recognize some of them because they are as well present here. All of them have vigorous sprouters that only recruit during interfire intervals. So according to our knowledge, none of these representative species of this genera, none of them disappeared because of any fire recurrence we have recorded so far. So you see our systems are very simplistic. So the key factor in our in the recovery of the ecosystem is plant cover, depending on the proportion of the sprouts in the community for the fire. This is an example mixing different sites with different soil types, different conditions, and then the recovery 6 months after the fire completely different to the abundance of the sprouts in the system. So this is relevant because this allows us to predict the recovery capacity of the systems on the knowledge of vegetation before the fire. We are lucky to have a very good database on life history traits of many species in relation to fire from our colleagues in Spain and other countries in Southern Europe. We have all these important traits in relation to fire response, and I know there is ongoing global database on plant traits, not especially related to fire, but it's useful anyway for this purpose. So this is kind of situating the differences or perhaps some similarities between Mediterranean and California. And now I will try to explain which is our approach for post-fire restoration. As I said before, we had suffered dramatic change in fire regime in the last decades. In addition, we have new perception of natural areas in the society. The tradition of planting pines is very old. Now people is asking other things. And we are more concentrating in ecosystem services, including biodiversity and other things. And of course, we try to make use of the present advances in fire and restoration ecology. So our approach is first trying to define, of course, we need, before making any project, we need a clear definition of the management objectives. We assume that we have general ones. We could have very specific one in different localities, but we assume these are the general application. The third one is avoid damages, as was mentioned before there. To increase resilience and biodiversity. Resilience, of course, is important because we have new fires sometimes. And to prevent new fires. This is relevant as well, so we try to combine restoration with fire prevention. Because fire will appear anyway. Then, once we have the objectives, we try to identify which ecosystems are vulnerable to fire in the affected areas. We need first to predict runoff and soil erosion risk, which is dependent on soil properties, but as well on the recovery rate of vegetation, which is a key factor in soil erosion. And the prediction of the dominant species regeneration capability, which is, has to do with the resilience and regeneration rate as a function of fire severity and the ecosystem characteristics. And then, after this analysis, we try to suggest the application of techniques to mitigate degradation and persist regeneration. A couple of words about erosion. In our systems, Mediterranean in general, the fires occur in summer, and the risk of heavy rains is right after the summer in autumn. We have two locations. This one is very rainy in north of Spain. This other one in red is in Valencia, where I live. It's lower, but it's the same period. And this is different than in California. And as you know better than me, that the fires could happen in relation to Santana winds, and the heavy rains appear later in winter. So the problem is that the heavy rains appear after the fire in both situations. So in that case, we have similar problems. But what is different, we don't have too many data that the McDonald from Colorado University make this is the scheme of our post-fire restoration assessment. First, we need, as I said before, the definition of management objectives, then the identification of vulnerable areas. As fire severity is not, at least at this moment, we cannot predict in advance, when we need a field survey or using remote sensing for assessing fire severity, and then combining these three questions, we prepare an action plan. We have a short-term action and long-term. Short-term include the management of childhood, which is very relevant in pine forest at least, and then eventually to apply fire rehabilitation techniques. And in the longer term, to make restoration, but always trying to include the principles of fire prevention in any restoration action. So what the strategies we're using is the objectives, as I said before, soil and water conservation, increasing ecosystem resilience, and increasing ecosystem and landscape quality, promoting diversity, and in many cases trying to increase the ecosystem maturity because we don't have many mature ecosystems in our lands. So the actions, so deciding why, where, when, and how, are selected according to the duration risk and to the objectives, assuming these general ecological objectives. And we have a first glance on the approach using the decision flow chart. We first decide we try to put in the first priority to avoid erosion risk because erosion is not reversible at the ecological scale. So if there is erosion risk or runoff, excessive runoff risk, we suggest applying emergency actions. If not, we analyze if the system is dominated by aggregate seeders, which are in addition fuel accumulators, we will see later. If this is the case, we suggest introducing, in fact reintroducing woodless routers to give more resilience to the system and less probability. If not the case, we analyze if there is natural regeneration of tree species, and if the objective of the restoration is to recover the forest, that could be other. This is the objective. We suggest planting of seeding trees, generally planting. If there is natural regeneration, in many cases we have overstopping for pines and for the sprouts in oaks. If this is the case, we make treatments, thinning or treatments for assist natural regeneration. If it is not the case, we do not. In fact, I will say more than 50% of the cases, the suggestion, much more than 50% of the cases of the land affected by the fire, the suggestion is to do that, fortunately. So this is one of the examples of doing nothing. And we have this cork oak, probably no cork oak, but sugar. It sprouts from the stems, there is the cork is there. And this sprouts from the canopy very quickly, in a few weeks. So in places where there is a very fast and complete natural regeneration, low erosion risk and runoff, so this is just doing nothing in that case, at least for ecological purposes. We suggest applying rehabilitation, emergency rehabilitation in degraded lands. We have high erosion risk and runoff risk. When we already know that the recovery rate of vegetation is very low, because it depends a lot on the vegetation types, and as environment that there are high boundaries of risk. So in this case, we apply techniques that were mentioned before by Dan, mulching, seeding, or an example of one of the sites where we suggested the seeding and mulching, but in this case, seeding using native plants, not exotics. And you see the plant regeneration with the control is the big color, relatively low after fire, and using seeding and mulching was much higher. This is an indication that during the recovery rate of this site was poor. And what is more important, combining on mulching, the infiltration capacity was higher compared to the control. Erosion rate was negative because we received sediments from the upper parts and the upper parts, and surface compaction was lower than in Andean or Andean. So these techniques are effective in reducing the early risk of the fire. So in some cases, in the same situation as before, there's the discussion about the management of the logs, if there are pines especially, and in some cases there's an economic interest of salvage logging, or perhaps for controlling pest diseases, but for the pest, bad beetles. And then we try to give some advice on how making salvage logging not in the land, perhaps using this material for preventing erosion risk if there exists in place. We have experiences of salvage logging producing more damage to the fire itself, like in this case, hauling the log produced more than 50 tons per hectare per year for 4 years after the fire, which is much higher than the one produced by the fires. So in some cases we recommend using this material for in the gullies, on the peaks, and in some cases if the erosion risk is very high, it would be effective in reducing erosion. We analyze some silt fences in microcatchments. But the effectivity of these systems, according to our experience, depends a lot on how it performs the implementation. And now it's becoming very popular using this system because it's really very spectacular and gives the impression for the managers or the policymakers that they are doing something very fast. Really very expensive, and it's becoming a little bit a mess. So the introduction of wood sprouters, the aim is increase fire resilience, and this the situation where this is recommended is when they are destroyed dominated by wood cedars, which are colonizing and have high fuel accumulators, and this is happening especially in oil fields. This species accumulate a lot of standing dead fuel, dead fine fuel, so it's really a very high risk for erosion, and in addition they recover slowly after the fire. So in this case we try to plant sprouters, shrubs, or trees, or both. This is well, we escape this, great. And when we have to start replacing fires, especially this happens for pines, when there are lack of seed sources in the vicinity of the affected area, or in shrublands or no fields, and when the management objective is to recover this forest, then we recommend the plantation of these species combining conifers and hardwoods. These are quite compatible, especially during the first decades after plantation. And they have, well, in fact, the pines that grow faster helps the growth of the hardwoods. Hardwoods include trees, but usually used as well as some shrubs. And finally, when we have too much recovery, it happens very often with pines. We suggest applying thinning in just few years after the fire, or cleaning of spruce in the case of coppices, which is many stems growing in our forest. This is an example of excessive pine regeneration. In many cases, we have tens of thousands of stems growing after the fire, which is really excessive and brings a lot of high risk after the regeneration. And then we combine clearing with plantation of hardwoods in this case. So according to our experience, the main ecosystem preserving post-fire restoration are usually previously degraded lands but other pressures, especially oil fields, which are in most of the cases where plant communities are dominated by organic cedars, causing erodible often developed on top substrates, like marl, granites, or shales, and in areas when all this is combined with areas suffering recurrence of fire, so interval fires. And I think I have to finish. I finish with these schemes right now. Okay, I finish with the scheme. I will develop tomorrow. This is the general scheme of the restoration we propose to the Forest Service. We propose 4 stages in the assessment of forest fire management. There is a time zero when the fire is before fire, when the fire is running. We make an early assessment using only available maps. And this is the aim of this early assessment is for the minister, when he is interviewed by the television, to have a first glance of the magnitude of the problem in ecological terms. And this is very much appreciated so far. Then we have the, like in Bell, the less than 1 year assessment of the possibility of climate emergency actions for the stabilization of the area. And then we suggest treatments, quality control of implementation of treatments, which is critical. In many cases, the treatments don't function because the implementation is very poor. And then a monitoring program for 3 years in this case that allows us to check if the treatments are effective or not and to react and to correct the application. Then around 5 years, we make the assessment for the regeneration reinforcement. The objective is to facilitate or enhance the recovery of vegetation and wildlife. And again, we have selection of treatments according to the objectives, quality control of the implementation and monitoring, and then the possibility of reacting. And longer term, we make a forest restoration, stronger restoration depending on the conditions, when the objectives are to increase ecological value of the system, in many cases combined with fuel control, and to increase this public service, the ecosystem services of the land, and again, quality control, evaluation, and possibilities of reaction. So this part is to reduce impacts, especially for the extremes. We combine this with the framework of the climate change. This probably will work the same or similarly in the future, but this should clearly be adapted to climate change. We will discuss this a little bit on tomorrow. So I think we stop here. Okay. I have 20 more as this is going.
So we've got, well, I can't read the clock anymore, but I think we have about 25 minutes or something like that for questions. And so I don't know if Jan and Marty, you guys want to come up, you're already sitting in the front row, but you can come up if you'd like to. And so we have an opportunity for questions and discussion here as well. I have a whole lot of questions myself, but I'd like to hold them and let other people ask questions if they want to start. Oh, I was going to say too late, okay.
This is a combined question. I know that there's funding for reforestation, but is there ever funding for re-shrubbing? Because I've never heard of chaparral being replanted, and I know that it does come back pretty well on its own if the invasives are controlled. But I was wondering about that. And then secondly, this might tie in with the earlier presentations and the big cone being replanted, but has the genetic diversity been studied? Because if you did go in and replant things, do you know if you're protecting a genotype that was specifically adapted to that place? So I suppose that applies to Spain and to California. And the last part of that whole question, so it all goes back to, what do you do to restore the chaparral? And the invasive removal only being for a year, when I did invasive removal, we saw like 900 tamarisk a day in 2 miles. And then the second year, there was a lot less, but there would still be 20, 30, 50, which would be enough to ruin a stream. So what do you do with all of those pieces to successfully restore chaparral so that you have genetic diversity that could thrive in the future? Sorry.
That was a 4-part question. Let me just note one thing before you start, Jen, is that we actually have a whole section tomorrow on implementation, and I think some of these are going to be dealt with a little bit more directly tomorrow, but go for it.
I was just about to say, we have a whole section on this. The funding. Well, I know there was reforestation or replanting of tree species after the station fire. You're involved with the station fire rehab. Some of that was, it was identified as a need in the Bear assessment, that there were places where forest vegetation wasn't going to recover without some assistance. It had to be funded other ways. But at the time, there were some groups that had money, companies that had money that wanted to do something. You get a lot of goodwill when you burn trees out, especially in Southern California in a fire. And there's all kinds of people that want to go out and replant trees. So money appears, whether from the Forest Service or somewhere else, to replant something like big Douglas fir, especially if it's in popular recreation areas. And anybody here from the Angeles, correct me if I'm wrong on all this stuff. So there actually was quite a bit of replanting, and I think a lot of the seed had actually been collected. Yeah, okay, there's Steve back there. Seed had been collected locally and kept up at in Placerville, is that right?
Yeah.
And they actually germinated those seeds, and so it was actually local genotypes and everything. It was pretty well done. It was unfortunate when the first batch were planted, they were sort of planted late in the spring, and then we had a really dry spring, and so there was a lot of regeneration failure. But I'll let the guy who was involved with a lot of that answer part of that question.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's typical for us that we use seed zones, but seed zones are genetically similar areas up and down the state. It's been around for almost 50 years now, 60 years. So we have 2 seed zones in the Angeles, 992, which we share with Los Padres, and we have 993, which is basically the same Gabriel Mountains. So we collect, in fact, this year is a pretty good year for big cones. We went up to Mount Wilson, which is just right up the hill here, and there's full cones. But there are probably cones that came from trees that are stressed, because we have 2 below average years. So there's lots of, it's surprising to us to have so many cones on big cone right along the roads and stuff. But so yeah, I mean, we use the seed. Big cone is one of our biggest concerns as far as regeneration. I mean, probably even with the county used to do a lot of plantings too, but mostly with watering and irrigation, and they had some pretty good success. Ours is mainly, we're not looking for how much percentage survival you have, how many trees we have per acre. So we're looking at 75 to 100 trees per acre. Most of these old stands probably had anywhere to 50 trees to 100 trees per acre. They were very open or very closed canopy with a lot of big trees, not more than 90, maybe feet tall. And some of them, some areas didn't get much of a fire into it, and so they're pretty much intact. Other ones were deforested. I mean, there's nothing but gravel out there. And that's the ones we concentrate on planting. Just natural regeneration, big cone, after this fire wasn't very good. You may have a couple seedlings in some areas per acre. Of all the species that we had burned, that about hit the worst. So, but it's a continuing process. We started in 2011. This is the 3rd year for planting. And big cone, you're going to have to replant a lot of times. It's just not very good for survival. And we don't really have 100% answers on why that is, because it's not been done. We're talking about 2,000 acres. That's a lot. In the past, they did maybe 50, 20 at the most. Not ever after fires.
So the funding goes to trees, not chaparral?
Yeah, for the most part. Now, I know there was some, an effort to plant some chaparral seed, I can't remember if it was seeds or seedlings, on some fire lines, dozer lines on a fire on the San Bernardino National Forest a few years back. And it was, I can't remember if they bought the seed or if they collected the seed, so it was, but it was local seed. And unfortunately, it was another one of those cases where, so it always happens this way, you lay out this great experiment, I think maybe they planted seeds and they had seedlings, and then it didn't rain part of the winter. And so there was failure of practically everything. I see somebody who's involved with the project now, it happens a lot in smaller scale restorations, like on roadsides and with construction projects too. So it has been tried in some cases, and we'll hear about some practical experiments in Chaparral Regeneration Farm. But on a large scale after fires, really there hasn't been critical need seen to do it so much. Now, when you get an area that's type converted and you get a big rain event and you get a bunch of slumping and you get a city flooded like in Highland a couple years ago, then there suddenly becomes some interest in, maybe we want the chaparral back up there after all. And so this is the whole purpose of a lot of this workshop is how do we do it? You know, help us figure out how to do it, because we haven't done it in the past, and we're beginning to see where we might need to.
Jamie has something she wants to say.
Yeah, here's somebody who knows something about it.
And then,
Use your mic, Dan.
I think I can talk
Okay.
loud enough. It's okay, I don't like mics.
I'll take it from
One
you.
of the questions that you had asked about was funding, and I did want to point out that there is one other source of funding that the Forest Service has been pursuing in the last few years, I think. And somebody could correct me as to when we started that. But that is the cost recovery funding that for resource damages that we go for when fires are started and determined to be a trespass fire. And then what we will do is we will do a resource damage report and say that because of the fire, there was this extra workload, and there is this anticipated workload that we can try to fund with projects. We can try to fund projects based on that fire recovery funding. So that is another one that comes down. It comes
And
under,
we're going to talk about that tomorrow too.
Oh, okay. Well, anyway, it comes under RI funding.
Yeah,
Let me tell you that it's a big no. In Spain, under reforestation, you can restore the matorral, the chaparral. So it's the same heading. Restoration of forest land include shrubland as well.
So I wanted to ask a question to Ramon, getting at that. Actually, Jamie, just what she brought up was important because one of the, just as an aside, there was a couple of things that really gave impetus to this workshop. One was just that there's sort of this developing problem now on parts of the Southern California landscape with as much degradation that we've had, where we're having trouble regenerating systems that used to regenerate themselves that we just forgot about. Like, this is going to be fine. The other thing is all of a sudden there's a pot of money that's starting to become available on some of these really high-profile fires, and it's a pretty extraordinary amount of money for some of these fires. And the issue is we don't have a toolbox right now in Southern California for how we properly use the money, how we think long-term, and that's exactly why we're having this workshop. So what I wanted to ask, and I think this would be mostly for you, Ramon, one of the things that always really impressed me about the way that the Spanish and some of the other Mediterranean countries actually look at the restoration needs on a landscape is, we saw the presentations by Marty and Jan on the BEAR programs and even on BAR. They're really very short term. They're very focused on, pretty immediate rehabilitation needs. They're not really very well funded. And you guys have a process where when you go out, even soon after the fire, you're actually already thinking way into the future. A lot of what you do is to think about the restoration potential on the site, the resilience long-term and all of that. And I'm wondering, I don't know what you're going to say to that, but I'd like you to underline that for us because it's profoundly different from the really short-term thinking that we give to restoration in these landscapes.
Well, we try to convince our policymakers that thinking only in the short term is not going to solve the problem. because you manipulate the succession, you increase the resilience of the system, you reduce the flammability of the system, then you have opportunities to have less problems with new fires. And if new fires happen, there were less necessity of replanting or doing whatever, because the system will be more resilient. So we try to convince them that the long-term perspective will reduce cost for short-term rehabilitation of fighting fire prevention. And this is probably this is the point. Because if not, with the systems are in the short-term fire cycles, with the same vegetation recovering and accumulating fuel in the very short term, we are solving nothing. We just invest all the money in cutting and combating the fire. So this is perhaps the point.
Well, I hope we can get there, and I don't see any hands, so I'm gonna ask another of my own questions. Okay, I'm coming to you.
But I want you to get one other thing, it's really important, is that, and this is why I think Europe is so useful for the Southern California comparison, okay? And that is that, okay, so this is the way I see the European systems. They're sort of dominated by super plants that have survived 2 or 5 or 10,000 years of humans throwing everything they can at them, right? And so you have this generally lower diversity of shrubs, for example. You have very few obligate cedars. There are very few of them, and the ones that are there are very weedy species that really you just want to get rid of. But in Southern California, there are a lot of non-sprouters or obligate seeding species which are of major conservation concern for us. And so it's different in that respect. And I'm wondering if you've got, and maybe Steve would have something to say about this as well, because the way in which you kind of deal with just replanting resprouters because they're less of a fire hazard, I don't think that from the conservation standpoint that's really going to be a profitable way for us to go here.
Just to take advantage of your comment, our obligate cedars in some way are similar to your exotics. They play a similar role. The difference is they are native. They are native, but they become extremely abundant in heavily disturbed sites, and they change fire regime. That's the question. We don't worry because of their exotics, but they become extremely dangerous for fire and for the recovery of the non-natural ecosystems. They are present in the more natural situations, but they are not dominant. They are only dominant in disturbed areas and after fire.
We have a question right here.
So my question has to do with like we're talking about timeframes over the landscape. How long are you guys looking out into the future? I mean, are we talking 20 years, 50 years, 100 years? And then on your fire return intervals, in the shrublands, what is that fire return interval?
Yeah, in these risky shrublands dominated by obligate cedars, the fire atonement interval is around 10-15 years. 10-15 years. So we try to avoid these so recurrent fires in the system. And our long-term perspective is forest management perspective. So it's around 100 years or so, the time for the full development of the system, being a forest or being one tall shrubland, which is similar to what Capella. This is the perspective.
Thank you.
Ramon, you mentioned that one of the tools in your toolbox is fire prevention activities, and I'm curious what kinds of fire prevention activities are done in Spain that perhaps might be different than what we do here. And then secondly, you talked a little bit about fuel controls, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the circumstances, conditions under which you are using fuel controls or fuel treatments, and the extent to which those are intended to protect natural resources or ecosystem values versus human infrastructure.
Well, in our work, we work in a research center, so we try to focus on the ecological aspects. When we make the assessment that we'll show tomorrow, we try to identify the human hazards, the cultural values of these things that are threatened by fires, and and then they take care or not of preserving it. In terms of fire prevention, there are two things. One of the classical approach of fuel control in using fire brakes, fuel brakes, and these kind of things. But in the longer term approach is trying to change the dynamics, the succession of vegetation, to move from high fire hazard communities to less flammable communities. So we have this perspective of trying to avoid this dominance of these very high fuel accumulators we have in the landscape. So this is an approach manipulating succession or manipulating restoration in some way. So we try to produce or to enhance communities that are less fire prone than the ones we have right now. We combine this with fuel treatment because it is a period when we are moving from one community to another one, and then you have to treat directly the fuels conventionally by shipping or clearing or other things. I will comment this a little bit more tomorrow.
Got about 5.
Well, in fact,
Don't make me ask more questions. Wait, you got a second?
I had there's one point, yeah. To comment this, yeah, take advantage of the question. This is one example of how we try to deal with these questions. This is an example of fire-prone shrubland. This is 30 years old shrubland, dominated by obligate cedars. There's plenty of fuel here, so more than 50 tons per hectare, but fine and partly dead fuel, which is really very risky for fires. So in this case, we make experiments of combining clearing and planting resprouters. 2 years after the fire, the system changed into a kind of grassland, different fuel model. And we control the regeneration of the obligate cedars by putting mulch on top of the soil, because these seeds require some scarification to germinate. So just putting mulch will reduce significantly the germination of the obligate cedars, which is the target. We don't eliminate them, but we reduce their dominance. And then, in addition, we had the introduction of the resprouters that in the long term we expect to change the community structure and the fuel accumulation rate. This is the main approach, based on the ecology, not only clean.
Ramon, how far out is that from the community? Is that right adjacent to these communities, or is that a distance away from them?
Sorry?
How far away from the communities are these treatments being done?
These treatments are done, there are plots of 1,000 square meters, these experiments.
But how far from human communities?
From here, sorry. Yeah, far away.
Far away.
Anyway, our legislation tried to oblige the owners of these houses in the wild and urban interface to apply this kind of measures. They tried to oblige by law. The problem is the enforcement of the law, of course. But this is on the legislation. Try to reduce fuels in the vicinity of houses, of course. But this is not only the idea of this treatment is not only reducing fuels, but changing the dynamics of vegetation towards less flammable vegetation in the long term.
So we're almost finished. So I have one for Jen and Marty. I'm wondering, it seems to me that if you look at the language that's behind the BEAR program, you had some of that highlighted in yours, Jen, where you noted that there was an opening there, as you put it, for, what was it, major impairment of, I don't know, something or other, vegetation communities that are at risk, or I don't know, making that language up. But what's the likelihood that something like that can be wedged into more of a commitment to actually doing that kind of work, rather than just saying we're gonna do it and not doing it?
In the past, there's been some, I think it was done, I can't remember now, on Cleveland, I don't remember if it was done with Bear Fund or some other, or NFN3 restoration funds. But where coastal sage scrub was burned too many times in a row, and there was the fear that there would be poor regeneration, and it was Habitat for California gnatcatcher, which is a federally listed species. They did some seeding after a couple of different fires, actually, with native species, trying to get the coastal sage scrub regenerated. So there are cases usually where a listed species is involved, where habitat restoration can be done with emergency funding.
Isn't that about half of all species in Southern California?
Yeah, but not very many in chaparral. There's one chaparral shrub, I think there's like one plant left, and, you know, maybe they could seed that if that one last plant ever burned, but I'm not sure. I don't know. Chaparral is so common, and most of the species in it are common too, so they don't fall into that listed species category. Do you have any examples?
Does that apply to both foraging and nesting habitat for birds, or is it one or the other?
Well, in the case of the gnatcatcher, the foraging and nesting habitats, they're sedentary, so it's the same thing.
I'm thinking of a hawk in particular. So
Yeah, I don't know. If it was a listed species, well, people worry about spotted owls, you know, up north, because they're listed, so, but that regeneration of the forest stands is a long-term thing, it wouldn't fall under bear anyway.
You're all on a tour, I think we're just about done, right?
Oh, yes.
Another question? Fantastic.
Just one question. From what I'm hearing today, as far as chaparral and recovery after fire, it's really after the first year that the chaparral is coming back and seed again. Not 3 years, not 5 years, not 10 years afterwards. And that your window for getting your restoration project is really within the first year. So for you to be able to react, you are in an emergency situation because you have to have the money, the finances, the resources, and the seed, and the delivery method all worked out in a relatively short amount of time. You can't, like with trees, you have a little bit of time, you can go to the nursery, you can grow them, hopefully you already have the seed, but if you can't hit that critical timing window, you're throwing seed on the ground that's just gonna die. So if it can't be incorporated in your emergency response, how do you expect to get it done?
Good question, and I think we'll talk about some of that tomorrow, so. But yeah, one of the biggest problems with chaparral restoration from the projects that have been done, and with coastal sage scrub, which is, there's been a lot more restoration attempted with coastal sage or California sage scrub, because it's habitat for the California gnatcatcher, is competition with the non-native grasses, which I cannot believe are not a problem in the Mediterranean, because it's their grass, but it really likes the habitat over here better. And so it seems like the first year after a fire, in natural chaparral regeneration, you get almost no non-natives first year after a fire. You'll get some seed in second, third, fourth year. And then they get shaded out and they go away. So the first year after a fire, if you really want to regenerate, restore chaparral, that's your opportunity, because you can get that stuff in the ground right then. And right now, under the funding mechanisms, you can't do that. So it's a kind of.
Well, it's not just that we don't have the funding mechanisms, we also don't have in place sort of the strategic, the ways of actually looking at the landscape. And what I like about what's going on in Europe is actually you've got flow charts, they've got this stuff figured out. It's a little bit of a simpler system, let's be honest, in some ways. But that's the other thing that's missing, right, is they kind of have already a process by which they do that long-term assessment. It gets done right then. Fire happens, they're on the landscape, and they're not thinking next week or the next rainfall. They're already thinking out years into the future, and they are making those decisions.
And you also have, I guess we'll talk about this tomorrow, but they also, you know how in the Forest Service we've got pretty much of a machine going with respect to how we regenerate conifer seedlings in the nursery, you know, all that stuff. They've got this going for shrubs and for hardwoods and everything, and that stuff's already all available and ready to be put on landscapes. We don't have that. So that's another thing that we'll probably talk about this tomorrow a little bit. So just FYI, we're pretty much out of time, but I did see one hand. We can do one more question.
Yeah, I'm getting a little irritated about this, oh, we have to restore within 1 year, because I have been looking at fern areas for years in Chaparral, just to see what would happen over a period of years. And what happens is, you get these fire followers in healthy chaparral the first year. But actually, the first thing that comes up is morning glory vines and wild cucumber, which spread vines all over the ground to protect it from erosion and to offer places for seeds to catch and come up. So, and you go in there, you rip that all out, and you bring in some seeds and throw them in the ground. Those seeds are waiting for the morning glory vine to shade them, and the cucumbers are not there anymore. So I'm looking at what you're doing, and I'm thinking, are you guys nuts? Because this is a step-by-step process. And, excuse me, in Spain, they're going towards climax forest, and I've lived 40 years in a 100-year-old chaparral, mixed chaparral, that no one ever wants to look at because it's so mixed. It never stops changing. It just continues, maybe shading out one species and letting another be the dominant. So you have to look at a bunch of years here. And unique place, I'm with the California Native Plant Society. We go in and there's a lady in our chapter who was champing at the bit to get back at Sycamore Canyon because she'd already cleared weeds out once before. And it was filled with fire followers when she did it, and she came down, and the campground was the weediest spot. So I would suggest that you look towards things like watershed, promoting repair of watersheds, and getting those root systems back in the ground. They probably still are. Melasma marina is the next thing that comes up, grows fast, provides food for the returning fauna, and has this huge root system that spreads everywhere and goes down deep. So you have shallow roots, you have medium roots, you have deep roots. If all you're going to go for is grasslands, you're going to have a watershed that's going to erode constantly. So I'm saying you have to have a longer view, and you need to work with people and conservation groups like ours that are quite willing to provide some money and lots of hard work, and who know we actually can move plants, which is helpful. We even know some fauna. So.
Yeah, well, I see the greatest threat of short interval fire not being to the sprouters, but to the Alpine cedars. And the ceanothus and the manzanitas don't come back from burl. And that's what we need to get out there. And you're exactly right. The morning glory and the wild cucumber do kind of protect those little seedlings the first couple of years. They're buried under there. I've been out there doing sampling. It's really irritating trying to can't see them. You have carpet in the morning glory. I know there were ceanothus out here last year. They're probably still there. I just can't see them. So yeah, we've got to figure out some methods to get those seeds out there without disturbing, if the other stuff's coming back, if you need it. Yeah, the problem is with short interval reburn, you're burning it when you're in that grass stage that you get in some places. We'll hear about it tomorrow. Yeah,
Well, thank you very much. It's time for us to adjourn. And just to remind you that tomorrow, if you are coming, and please do, we're starting at 8:15. Again, we'll be talking about implementation. Thank you, by the way, to our speakers.
Thank you.